In this video, we're going to talk about the structure of the atom. The last time that we were together in lecture, we discussed that all of the matter around us, all of this stuff, all of these things around us are made up of tiny particles that we're going to call atoms. So when we look at this aluminum can, what we can think of it as are these tiny, solid, spherical particles stuck together that make up that matter. Over here, you can see the carbon atoms stuck together. And we said, just think of them as tiny, solid little spheres right now stuck together. We said, like before the aluminum can, if all of the atoms that are stuck together are exactly the same, we're going to call it an element, just like this here and this over here. But if the atoms are different from one another that are stuck together, as in this middle picture, we're going to call that a compound. So there's two types of matter up to this point. One, all the atoms are exactly the same. We call it an element. All of the atoms, there are different types of atoms, two or more types of atoms, we're going to call it a compound. Now, what we're going to be moving forward to is learning the different types of elements that exist in the entire universe, all the different types of atoms that exist. We talked about taking a book with hundreds and hundreds of pages and shaking all of the words and paragraphs off of the pages and then separating them into their individual letters. We end up with 26 different letters, 26 different piles, A through Z. Some of the piles would be very large, some of the piles would be very small. The vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, big piles of vowels because every single word contains a vowel. But some of the lesser used letters, such as Z, you won't have as big of a pile of those, but there would be 26 piles. It turns out that if we took the entire universe and shook it apart so hard that it fell apart into its individual atoms, we would end up with 118 different types of atoms. Those different types of atoms we call elements. The elements are listed on a table, and there are some trends, there are some periodicities that occur within that list of elements. For instance, our calendar has some periodic properties in it. Every so often we hit a Monday. Every so often we hit a number 1 of the day of the month. Every so often we hit January. There are some periodic properties in our calendar. There's also some periodic properties within this list of elements. So we title this list of elements the periodic table of the elements. This is a list of all the different types of atoms that exist in the entire universe. And we have a list of these from 1 all the way to 118. Now you'll see on this list that's shown here, 113, 115, 117, and 18 aren't shown. At the time that this periodic table was published, those 4 elements hadn't been produced yet. So it turns out, and we can place this information on our quantum mechanical structure of the atom handout, it turns out that these atoms are not solid spheres. We started out the course by saying that they were solid spheres so that we could get an understanding that all of this matter is made up of atoms, and that if the substance contains all the same type of atoms, we call it an element. But if the atoms are different from one another, we call it a compound. Now we're going to move on from thinking of these atoms as solid spheres, but instead they have two primary parts to them. And we're going to put this information on our handout. The first part is that every atom has a nucleus, and that nucleus is in the center of the atom. It's a very small, dense center, and that nucleus that we call the nucleus contains two types of particles. It contains protons and it contains neutrons. So we're finding out that these atoms that make up all this matter, including myself and the desk and the chair and the computer, all this stuff around us, these atoms are not solid spheres. They're made up of parts to them, and there's two parts, an inner part and an outer part. The inner part is called the nucleus, and it contains two types of, we're going to call them subatomic particles, because they're within, like a submarine goes within the water, a subway goes within the ground. Subatomic means within. Within the atom, within the nucleus, the center part, there are two types of particles, the protons and the neutrons. And then surrounding the center part is called the electron cloud. And there, where the nucleus is a small, dense center, the electron cloud is large and mostly empty space. So there's parts to the atom, two parts to the atom. Now, here's a good picture of the atom, where there's a tiny center that we call the nucleus. There are protons and neutrons inside that nucleus, and then this shaded area on the outside is called the electron cloud, and that's where the electrons are. So there's going to be three. These atoms are not solid little spheres. There's actually three types of particles that make up these atoms. The inside part are protons and neutrons packed tightly together. And then this shaded region on the outside is the electron cloud. And that is where the electrons are moving around. This outside part of the atom, where this shaded area is mostly empty space. And then the protons and the neutrons are packed tightly together in the nucleus. Another picture of this is taking one of these little solid spheres, what we used to call solid little spheres, and now blowing it up and looking at one of those solid little spheres and finding out they are not at all a solid little sphere. There's a nucleus where there are protons and neutrons packed tightly together. The nucleus is very tiny in size, but it's very massive, which means it's dense. This outside region here is the electron cloud. We're going to find out later that the electron cloud is broken up into energy levels. And that is where the electrons are flying around. And this area out here is mostly empty space. So these atoms that are connected together, here we would call it an element because all of the atoms are exactly the same. When we blow that atom up and look at an individual atom, it is not a solid sphere. There are two parts to it, a nucleus on the inside where the protons and neutrons are, and this empty space out here where the electrons are. We say it's mostly empty space because most of the space is empty, but there are electrons. There are three what we call subatomic particles that make up the nucleus. What we're going to do now is we're going to investigate Ernest Rutherford's experiment that took place in the early 1900s, a little over 100 years ago, and how he discovered that the atom was not a solid sphere, but that it actually had separate parts to it, the nucleus and the electron cloud. I hope this helps understanding the structure of an individual